Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us in this discussion presented by the FW de Klerk Foundation. I'm joined today by the Foundation's chairman, Mr. Dave Steward, and Advocate Mark Oppenheimer. Advocate Oppenheimer is a practicing member of the Johannesburg Bar and an expert in constitutional law matters. Dave and Mark will be discussing briefly the recent Constitutional Court judgment, in which it made a very interesting ruling that the Independent Electoral Commission, or the IEC, may reset the candidate registration deadline for the upcoming 2021 elections. Mark and Dave will be discussing a number of matters incidental hereto, and perhaps cast a view on what this might mean for voters and the upcoming municipal elections. So welcome, Mark, Dave, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Jacques. Mark, can you give us your view on the impact of this judgment? It is obviously going to have an effect on the forthcoming municipal election. It would have been a different kind of election if the ANC hadn't been allowed to go ahead with the late registration of so many of its candidates. What do you make of it all?
Yeah, so you're right. It would have been a very different election. If you look at the ANC's papers, they say that they didn't run a single PR candidate in the whole of the Western Cape, which means they wouldn't have appeared on the ballot. In 13 municipalities in which they currently govern, they would have auto-lost. I think they said there were 536 ward councillors who they didn't run. Now, why didn't they do it? They didn't do it because they stopped paying their staff, and their staff went on a go-slow, and they refused to register candidates. It also appears to be the case that there's a fair amount of internecine squabbling that's going on in the party, different factions vying for their candidates to be placed there. And so they didn't get their ducks in a row. Now, to understand this first judgment from the Constitutional Court, we have to understand the case regarding the postponement of the elections in the first place. So the IEC had approached the Constitutional Court on an urgent basis, saying that they were of the view that it would not be possible to hold a free and fair election by the 27th of October, which was the date that had been proclaimed by Minister Dlamini Zuma. And largely this was based on COVID concerns. Ultimately, the court dismissed their application, found that they had an obligation to hold the election. And one of the things that had come out during that process was elections are not the kind of thing that happen on a day. So it requires an enormous amount of planning. Ordinarily, this is done on about, I think, between 75 days and 86 days. And the EFF had specifically asked for a certain kind of relief. They said, look, in the event that a postponement is not granted, will you reopen the candidate lists? We're concerned that we will not be able to register our candidates in time. And the IEC directly responded to that and said it's not possible. They said we can't do that because if we have to run the election by the 26th of October, there are so many things that we'll have to do before then to ensure that the election is free and fair, which means vetting that the candidates are proper, making sure that enough ballots are printed on time. I think they say about 78 million ballots have to be printed. It's really 4,723 simultaneous elections that are happening because it's municipal. So an enormous burden on the IEC, and they say, that deadline for candidate registrations was on the 16th of August. We've already extended to the 23rd, and we will not extend it beyond that. They then don't get their postponement. And the ANC launched litigation to say, well, we want you to extend the candidate nomination process because if you don't, we're in terrible trouble. And a day later, the ANC withdraw their case. The Concord judgment comes out, it becomes clear that a postponement won't be granted, and the IEC suddenly changed their tune, and they say, well, we think it's necessary for free and fair elections to extend candidate registration. And part of their reason for doing this is they said, well, we think we can now hold a voter registration weekend, which they also said was impossible, and those two things have to be coupled together. The argument was that there will be some people who want to run as candidates who are not registered to vote, and it will be unfair on them to not reopen candidate registration after registration weekend. So I acted for the Institute for Race Relations in both matters, the original postponement case and the candidate registration case. And we said, look, there are a couple of avenues available to the IEC, and let us tell you why none of them are truly available. The IEC's initial case was they said, well, the court's order that's come out entitles us to reopen candidate registrations. The court order said, if it's possible to hold a registration weekend, then the IEC must do whatever is reasonably necessary. And they said, well, reasonably necessary means we can reopen candidate registration. Now, the court considered this in the argument. They said, no, it doesn't. They said, it's very clear if you read our order that we were referring to voter registration. And that is something that is important. All these people have been disenfranchised because you haven't held a voter registration, and you must do what's necessary for that purpose, not for candidate registration. So the order definitely doesn't grant you this power. Second argument we had was we said, look, the courts considered this question with regards to the EFF. They asked for that relief, and the court dismissed the relief. The court took the view that it had dismissed the relief, but it had dismissed it for a different reason, which is that the EFF had made it contingent on a change to the regulations on lockdown. They wanted it to be extended to 100 people for gatherings so they could hold these kinds of mass rallies or registrations. The question then became, well, is there a residual power that the IEC has in terms of the Municipal Electoral Act? And there are two kinds of powers. The one is, if you've postponed an election, you can amend your election timetable. So the IEC said, well, we're going to postpone this election because it was going to be on the 27th of October, and now it's going to be on the 1st of November. And the court said, no, it's not a postponement. You asked for a postponement. We specifically said you can't have one. And we declared the minister's prior proclamation a nullity. So it's not changed. There is a date, but it's not a postponement kind of date. So you don't have that power there. But what the IEC does have is, in its own determination, if it decides that it's necessary to amend the timetable for a free and fair election, then they have that power. We said, look, there is another way to go about this, and the DA had a different solution. The DA said, look, if you're concerned about this narrow class of people who are candidates who are not themselves registered, well, then reopen for them. Have a limited candidate registration reopening. The IEC said, well, we can't do it because it would require tinkering to our system, and that's going to take 2 or 3 weeks. We don't have the time, so we just have to have a free-for-all. We said something different, which was that the IEC has already identified all these candidates. They have a list of people who'd applied and who later turned out to have not been registered. And the way that our act is drafted is quite interesting. It's not that it's a requirement to put your name forward to be registered. It's just that the obligation is on the IEC to remove you from the list if it turns out you're not registered. So we said it's very simple. Wait for the registration weekend. Check that list of about 1,300 people. Whoever's registered, you keep them on the list. Whoever didn't get registered, you remove them from the list. You don't need to reopen candidate registrations at all for this practical problem. We also argued that there's a built-in deadline in the Act, which says that when you set your timetable, you have to comply with it by a certain period of time. And if you don't do so, then you can't anymore. The court ultimately held that the IEC does have this power and said, look, they're the organization charged with running elections. If they say it's going to interfere with freeness and fairness, then as a court, we don't want to intervene on that front, and we trust them. But we do take it that there's been many allegations of bias. There's a huge concern that the IEC have done this only because the ANC would be in such serious trouble if they don't. And they leave the door open. They say, if the DA want to run a challenge to these elections after the fact, on the basis they think that the IEC acted in a biased manner, not for the sake of freeness and fairness, then this judgment won't close that door.
Okay, so there's some good bits and there's some bad bits. In the first place, the Constitutional Court in the original judgment didn't accept the IEC's argument about postponing the election. So that's a positive. It's also a positive that they maintain a degree of skepticism about the intentions of the IEC, and they specifically say that if there are any allegations of bias in the management of the elections, then parties will be perfectly free to challenge those. But at the same time, Section 11.3 of the Municipal Elections Act looks pretty straightforward. It says, any act required to be performed in terms of the Municipal Elections Act must be performed by no later than a date and time stated in the election timetable. Now, that election timetable had already been published by the IEC. So how on earth does the Constitutional Court get over that? Or is it just a question of force majeure?
Yeah, so we were the only party to raise that 11.3 argument. And our line was, it's very clear. Once a deadline has passed, it's too late. The court deals with it very briefly in its judgment, and it implies that, well, you can always amend the timetable. So in other words, if the deadline was 23rd of October and it's now the 24th, well, 23rd August and it's now 24th August, well, then you amend the deadline, put it into the future, and then you haven't broken the deadline. That's kind of strange to my mind, because it implies that, well, really the section does no work. It's not a deadline if you're always free to amend it after the fact. Unfortunately, the nature of this case was such that it was dealt with extremely urgently. There was no oral argument permitted. It had to be dealt with on such an urgent basis because the registration weekend was a few days after the arguments had come in. And so the court decided to produce a judgment on the papers. It would have been the kind of thing that I think would have warranted a back and forth discussion, because it's definitive. If the IRR were right about 11.3, well, then it's game over. The court does consider the point, they don't ignore it, but we took a different view.
So what emerges here is that there's clearly a double standard being applied by the IEC in the manner in which they dealt with the EFF application and the manner in which they dealt now with the ANC application. And this, of course, has implications that go far beyond this particular case. The whole democratic system depends absolutely on the impartiality of the IEC. What does this judgment say about that impartiality? And is this not going to be an increasingly serious problem as we approach a situation in South Africa where the ANC might lose major elections?
Yes, I think it's a vital concern. I mean, I think all citizens have a strong interest in having an electoral commission that is truly independent and is not dependent on the whims of a particular party. I mean, the other thing that's concerning is that this issue had arisen before in prior cases. So the IFP and the NFP were non-compliant in different respects in prior elections. I think it's 2016 and 2011. And the IEC said fairness and fairness means holding everyone to the same deadlines. That's what it requires. Those matters went to the Constitutional Court, and ultimately there was a decision that your exclusion from the elections is free and fair because you didn't get your ducks in a row. But when it comes to the ANC, it seems that the standards are different, and that's a concern. I mean, one of the things that's not expressed in the judgment, and I think wasn't uttered by anyone overtly, is that there would have been consequences if the ANC were locked out in these places. In other words, a lot of people who have been voting for the ANC since 1994 are going to get to the ballot box, and they're going to see that their party of their choice is not on the ballots, and there'll be some huge outrage around this. The consequences could have been a multivariate. The one would be that people choose a second preference. The data shows that that's sort of evenly split between the DA, the EFF, and other parties, with the IFP having a large share of those other parties in KwaZulu. The other consequence could have been a lack of legitimacy around the elections, that people would have acted out violently, that they would have, could have had protests and various other things. Now, those are not the kinds of things that you can really take into account. They're speculative, and so the court doesn't address them. But there's some sense in which, if you're a realist about what goes on with courts, that may have very well have been a factor that was sitting in people's minds, especially considering that we've just had a spate of violent protest stemming from another court decision, namely the Zuma case, where there you had Zuma supporters being riled up to go and loot and burn down shops, and so that may have been playing on people's minds.
So I guess this is the reason why organizations like Freedom Under Law, which have a pretty good track record in litigating against the government, supported the IEC in this. Were they relying on the peremptory requirement for elections in Section 1 of the Constitution over what some people would have regarded as being technicalities? And would they not have thought that the other precedents, EFF and IFP and so forth, were not perhaps so significant because their participation in the elections wouldn't have changed the result very much. But here you have a situation where the non-compliance of the ANC with the registration requirements might have had a very significant impact on the outcome of the elections.
Yeah, Freedom Under Law's participation is interesting. So they took part in both bits of litigation. In part one, they were virulently opposed to the postponement relief that the IEC sought, and they said that you cannot be granted, that the Constitution is very clear that you have to have regular elections, as built into Section 1, and Section 159 says every 5 years, and you're allowed a 90-day window beyond that, but not a day further. And so they took a very hard line on that. On part two, the line they took was surprising in that they said the Constitutional Court should dismiss this case up front because it amounts to lawfare. And they said that the court shouldn't sully its good name by getting involved in a political dispute. The court, by the way, disagreed. The court said, no, hold on a second here. The DA has brought a case that warrants attention. They have very good reason to have challenged what the IEC has done. The IEC have said they're doing this on an illegitimate purpose, which is on the basis of the court's order. And the court said, our court order definitely doesn't empower what you're trying to do. But it points out that there's another avenue. But I found that a surprising take from Freedom Under Law. But, I suppose the NGO world is an interesting one, and people do act independently and, for whatever reasons they have.
Now, the Constitutional Court also had a crack against Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma and referred to her proclamation as irrational. What were they saying there? What was their objection to NKZ?
Yes, irrational, invalid, and unconstitutional. So basically, her initial line was she said, well, I had an obligation to proclaim an election date. And I had to do it within a certain period of time. But if you read what the law says, it says that she must do it within this 90-day window of the expiry of the municipal councils, but there's no particular time. Now, the concern with her proclaiming was that as soon as she proclaimed, the legislation stops registration from occurring. So it meant that because the IEC hadn't run registration weekend, and they ordinarily would run two, all those people who had moved or who were new voters who hadn't been registered would have been disenfranchised. And so the court ultimately held, it was irrational given the circumstances for it to have proclaimed early. What rather should have happened was that the IEC would have tried to run a registration weekend, she would have proclaimed afterwards. And that's why they set her decision aside.
So summing up, would it be fair to say that this whole disarray within the ANC, both from the point of view of their lack of ability to register candidates on time and the nature of Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma's proclamation, B, serious concerns relating to the IEC and the IEC's impartiality, which really might have very, very far-reaching implications for South Africa's democratic future, and C, that the Constitutional Court is still out there defending the Constitution, not always to the degree to which some litigants would like, but it is also not a pushover. It is holding a line in defending the Constitution.
Yes, I think that's an excellent diagnosis on all three fronts. I think one of the things on your point about the ANC being in disarray, there might be one significant reason which hasn't really been spoken about much why they're in such disarray, which is the requirements which are new that parties have to disclose where their funding comes from for all amounts that are over 100,000 Rand. And so it came out that the ANC have disclosed they received only 10 million Rand from private donations because people don't want to put their name to those checks anymore because they're concerned it will implicate them in some sort of scandal. So to put that in perspective, Cyril Ramaphosa's personal campaign inside the ANC when he was competing against Dlamini Zuma had a 1 billion Rand budget. if you only have 10 million rand for your, your municipal election, which is happening every 5 years, you're in serious financial straits, which explains why they're not paying their staff, why the money that they were supposed to have paid over to SARS and POAE, they've not paid over. It's 80 million rand. And then the other thing voters should ask themselves is, if this party that I've been supporting for so long can't pay its staff, can't get its ducks in a row to register candidates when all the other political parties could do it. I mean, ATM, which is, I think, got 2 or 3 seats in parliament, registered candidates across the country. Are they really the guys you want to govern you? Are they the guys you trust to make sure that you get water on time and your potholes are fixed? I would think not.
Thanks a lot for commenting on this latest Constitutional Court case. Very, very important for South Africa. Very, very important for future elections.